Okay, so you know how when we're really trying to learn something or achieve a goal, our emotions can kind of run the show?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
They can either be our biggest cheerleaders or totally sabotage us.
Right. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole idea of how our feelings tie into achievement. Specifically, we're tackling the control value theory of achievement emotions.
Absolutely. We're going to break down what this theory actually says, how it explains all those feelings we get about succeeding and failing, and just the whole act of learning itself. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll have a much better grasp on how to use this theory to understand why we react the way we do in these situations, and maybe even figure out how to make those reactions work for us rather than against us. You sent over some super interesting excerpts from a research article on this, which I think will be a perfect guide for us today. And one thing that really jumped out at me was how this theory pulls from so many different areas of psychology to paint a much more complete picture of what's happening emotionally when we're striving for something. It brings together ideas about expectations and attributions and how all of that impacts our learning and performance. It's pretty fascinating stuff. So to kick things off, let's define our terms here. What exactly are we talking about when we say achievement emotions?
Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's any emotion that's directly linked to, you know, the stuff we do to achieve something or to the actual outcome of those efforts. So it's not just general good or bad moods, it's tied to our actions and the results we get in situations where we're trying to achieve something.
Gotcha. So it's very specific to that whole goal-oriented context.
Yeah.
And the theory breaks these achievement emotions down even further, right?
Yeah, they make a distinction between what they call activity emotions and outcome emotions.
Okay, I'm curious about this. What kinds of feelings fall into each of those categories?
So, activity emotions are those feelings we have while we're actually in the process of learning or working on something. Like, imagine that feeling of total enjoyment when you're super absorbed in a tough problem and it's challenging, but you're making progress. Or that frustration when you just can't wrap your head around a concept no matter how hard you try. Or even boredom when something's either way too easy or way too difficult and you're just not engaged.
Right. So these are all about how we feel during the journey itself, the process of working towards the goal. And then what about those outcome emotions? What are those focused on?
Outcome emotions are all about, well, the outcome. It's that feeling of joy or pride you get after acing a presentation, or the anxiety, or maybe even shame after a big setback. But what's cool is these outcome emotions can actually happen before we even know the result.
Oh, you mean like anticipating the outcome?
Exactly, like the hope you might feel before getting feedback on a project, or on the flip side, that sense of dread that can creep in. So we have these prospective outcome emotions where we're looking ahead at what might happen, and then obviously the retrospective ones that come after we get the results.
That makes a lot of sense. It really shows how our emotions around achievement aren't just about the moment of success or failure, but there's this whole build-up and aftermath as well. Now, the theory also talks about state and trait achievement emotions. Can you explain that difference?
Sure, this one's a bit more straightforward. State emotions are those temporary, in the moment feelings we get in a specific situation. Like, think about that rush of nervousness right before you have to give a speech that's a state emotion. And then there are trait emotions, which are more like these habitual patterns, the kinds of feelings you tend to have pretty consistently in achievement situations. And what's really important here is these trait emotions can actually be very specific to certain areas. Like someone might always feel anxious in math class, but be totally fine in other subjects.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you could have a general tendency toward anxiety, but then trait mathematics anxiety would be this more specific anxiety that's triggered anytime you're dealing with numbers or equations.
Oh,
Okay, so now we're getting to the heart of the theory, the two main things that drive all of these different achievement emotions. What are those key players?
these are the real engines of the theory: subjective control and subjective value.
Okay, break those down for us.
All right, so subjective control is basically how much influence we think we have over our own actions and the outcomes that happen because of those actions. It's about whether we feel like we're calling the shots or if things are just happening to us.
Gotcha. So it's about agency, right? How much of a role we think we play in what happens.
Exactly. And then there's subjective value, which is basically how important or how appealing we find those activities and the outcomes to be. It's about the emotional weight we attach to them, whether positive or negative.
So one is about how much control we think we have, and the other is about how much we care about the whole thing. Interesting. Let's dive a little deeper into subjective control first. The theory gets pretty specific about how we perceive control, right?
Yeah, it breaks it down into a bunch of different components, which I think is really helpful.
Awesome. Walk us through those different parts.
Okay, so the first one is situation outcome expectancies. This is basically our expectation of whether a particular situation will lead to a specific outcome, regardless of what we do or don't do. It's kind of like saying, well, this task is just way too hard. I'm going to fail no matter how much I try. It's about feeling like the situation itself is determining what's going to happen.
I see. So it's about perceiving the situation as the main cause, not our own actions. What's next?
Then we have action control expectancies. These are our beliefs about whether we can even do the actions needed to achieve the goal. It's like self-efficacy, but it's more focused on the can I even do this part, not necessarily whether doing it will guarantee we get the outcome we want.
Ah, so it's not about whether the action will be effective. It's about whether we believe we're even capable of doing it in the first place.
Exactly. And then we have action outcome expectancies, which is where we connect the actions we take to the specific results. It's the belief that if I do this particular thing, it'll likely lead to this specific outcome. So for example, if I actually buckle down and study, I'll probably get a good grade on the test.
Okay, so we've got the situation maybe leading to the outcome on its own, our belief in whether we can even do the actions needed, and then our belief that those actions will lead to a specific result.
Yeah.
How do all of these pieces fit together?
That's where total outcome expectancies come in. This is like the big picture of our expectations, where we combine all those other expectancies to create a sense of whether a positive or negative outcome is likely to happen and how much control we have over that. So if we're expecting success, our total outcome expectancy is high. If we think the situation is already favorable, like if the task is easy, or if we believe we can do the things needed to succeed, or if we think both of those things are true.
Okay, so it's about how all those expectations add up to create our overall sense of whether success is likely. And what about when we're expecting failure? How does that work?
For those negative outcomes, like failing, our total outcome expectancy is high if we believe failure is going to happen no matter what we do, and if we also feel like we don't have much control over preventing it. And that lack of control can come from thinking we can't even do the actions needed, or from thinking that even if we could do them, they wouldn't make a difference in the outcome. I think what's really insightful here is how the theory highlights that feeling powerless isn't just one thing. It can come from believing the situation is against us no matter what, or from doubting our own abilities, or from feeling like our actions are pointless. And recognizing those different sources of that feeling of powerlessness is key to finding ways to overcome it.
That's a really interesting distinction. It's like there are different flavors of feeling powerless. And the last piece of subjective control involves looking backward, right?
Right. That's causal attributions of outcomes. This is about how we explain why we succeeded or failed after it's already happened. Did we do well because of something internal, like our effort or ability, or was it due to something external, like luck or the difficulty of the task itself? And the theory really emphasizes how these attributions we make shape our sense of control over future actions and outcomes. So if we blame a failure on something we can change, like not studying enough, it gives us more of a feeling of control than if we blame it on something we can't change, like thinking we're just not cut out for the subject.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about the other big player here, subjective value. What are the components of that?
So subjective value is about how much we care about the activity itself and the outcome. This is where things get into what really matters to us. And it breaks down into intrinsic values and extrinsic value.
Oh yeah, those classic types of motivation. So intrinsic value is when we value something just for the pure enjoyment of it, right? Exactly. It's when we're doing something simply because we find it interesting or fun or inherently satisfying. Like imagine someone who loves solving puzzles just for the sheer pleasure of figuring things out. That's pure intrinsic value.
Yeah, it's about the reward coming from the activity itself. What about extrinsic value?
That's when we see the value of something in terms of what it can get us. It's about its usefulness and helping us achieve other goals. For example, valuing good grades because they can help you get into college or land a better job. That's classic extrinsic value.
So it's not so much about enjoying the activity itself, but more about what it can help us accomplish down the line. And how do those two types of value come together?
They combine to form what the theory calls outcome value, which is basically the overall importance we put on a particular outcome. And this takes into account both how much we enjoy the activity that leads to it and what potential benefits that outcome might bring. Okay, so we've got these two big players. Subjective control, with all its different parts, and subjective value, with its intrinsic and extrinsic sides. Now, the million-dollar question. How does the control value theory actually link all of this to specific emotions we feel in these achievement situations?
This is where things get really interesting. The theory says that different combos of how much control we feel like we have and how much we value the situation or the outcome will lead to us feeling specific types of achievement emotions. And these can be emotions about potential outcomes, past outcomes, or even emotions we experience while we're in the middle of the activity itself.
Right. So depending on that mix of control and value, we might feel anxious, excited, hopeful, or even totally deflated. Let's start with those prospective outcome emotions, the ones we feel about what might happen in the future, whether it's success or failure. How do control and value play into those?
Okay, so for those positive feelings about future outcome, like anticipatory joy or that feeling of relief when we think something bad might not happen, those are linked to a strong belief that we're going to succeed or that the negative thing we're worried about won't actually occur. And this is combined with placing a high value on that success or on avoiding that negative outcome. It's like we're looking forward to something good that we think is likely to happen and that something really matters to us. On the other hand, hope is tied to a more moderate expectation of success where it's possible but not a sure thing, but it's still something we really care about. I think if we look at our own experiences, we can probably see how our levels of hope versus anxiety about a situation are directly tied to how likely we think it is that we'll succeed and how much we really care about the outcome.
Yeah, for sure. Hope lives in that space of uncertainty where it could go either way, but the positive outcome is something we're really rooting for. What about the negative feelings we can have about future outcomes?
Well, anxiety tends to pop up when we have a moderate expectation of failure. We're not sure if we're going to fail or not, and we really, really don't want to fail. That high negative value on the outcome really fuels the anxiety. And then there's hopelessness, which is connected to either a low expectation of success or a high expectation of failure, and again, a situation or an outcome that really matters to us. But in this case, we just don't feel like we have the power to make it happen.
So with both hope and anxiety, there's still a sense of possibility, but with hopelessness, it feels like it's already a done deal and not in a good way.
Exactly. And it's interesting how value, whether positive or negative, really amplifies these feelings. If we don't really care about the outcome, then whether we think we'll succeed or fail doesn't hit us nearly as hard emotionally. And of course, it's not always just one emotion at a time. We can definitely have those mixed emotions too, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially in those situations where we're not sure how things are going to turn out.
Yeah.
It's totally normal to feel hope and anxiety at the same time as we kind of weigh those possibilities of succeeding and failing. It's like being on a roller coaster. Okay, so what happens when the outcome has actually happened? How do control and value influence those retrospective outcome emotions, the feelings we have after we get the results?
Well, the theory splits those into two categories, control-independent emotions and control-dependent emotions. Let's start with control-independent ones.
Sure. What are those?
These are the emotions that are mainly driven by the outcome itself and how important it was to us, regardless of how much control we felt like we had. So it's like feeling pure joy when we succeed, or sadness and frustration when we fail, or feeling disappointed when we expected to succeed but it didn't happen, or that feeling of relief when we thought we were going to fail but we didn't. It's a very direct emotional response to the result.
It makes sense that those feelings wouldn't necessarily be tied to our sense of control. They're just about how we feel about the outcome itself. What about the control-dependent emotions?
This is where our explanations for why things happened, those attributions we talked about, really come into play. Pride and shame are tied to internal attributions. So, if we see ourselves as the main reason for our success, we feel proud, and if we think we're the reason we failed, we feel ashamed. And of course, these emotions are also tied to how much we valued the outcome in the first place. On the other hand, gratitude and anger are linked to attributions about external causes. So we feel grateful if we think other people helped us succeed, and we might feel angry if we think other people were the reason we failed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Those more self-conscious emotions like pride and shame, or those socially directed emotions like gratitude and anger, are definitely shaped by who we think is responsible for the outcome. And again, we can have those mixed bag of emotions when we're looking back.
Right. Definitely. It's rare that we see just one clear cause for a success or a failure. So it's totally normal to feel a mix of things, like being proud of our own effort, but also feeling grateful for the help we got from others.
All right, let's wrap up our emotion tour with activity emotions.
Mhm.
Those feelings we have while we're actually engaged in the activity in the thick of things. How do control and value fit into this?
This is where we really get into the experience of learning itself. So, enjoyment, that feeling of really being into what we're doing and finding it satisfying, that comes from a high sense of control over the activity and seeing it as something valuable and enjoyable. It's like that flow state where we're totally absorbed and in the zone.
Ah, yes, that feeling of mastery and pure engagement, it's a great feeling. It really is. Now, anger during an activity can actually happen too, believe it or not. This usually pops up when we feel like we have a lot of control over the activity, but we see the activity itself as a negative thing. Like, if we're forced to do something we really dislike, but we know we're capable of doing it. Frustration, on the other hand, is more about feeling stuck. It comes from that low sense of control when we just can't seem to make progress no matter what we try.
It's like hitting a wall. And then there's that universal experience of boredom. When does that one tend to show up?
According to the theory, boredom comes knocking when the activity doesn't have enough value or incentive for us. And this can happen in a couple of ways. Either the task is just too easy, so there's no real challenge to keep us engaged, even though we have high control, or it's way too difficult, so it feels totally out of reach, which also leads to boredom because we lack that sense of control. It's about that mismatch between our skills and the demands of the task, no matter which way the imbalance tips.
So, in a way, it's about finding that sweet spot of challenge where we feel like we can make progress, but it's not just a walk in the park. Now, do these appraisals of control and value and the emotions that come from them, do they always have to be super conscious and deliberate?
That's a great question. Turns out they don't. Sometimes it's more automatic, like a reflex. When we've had a lot of similar experiences in certain situations, we might develop what the theory calls subconscious appraisals and habitualized achievement emotions. So, for example, a student who's had a lot of anxiety in test situations might start to feel anxious as soon as they walk into a classroom where a test is about to happen, even before they consciously start thinking about the test itself. Their brain has basically learned to associate that situation with anxiety. But the cool thing is that when something changes, or we actually make an effort to pay attention to our thoughts, those conscious appraisals can come back into play and potentially even change those automatic emotional responses. This is a really important point because it suggests that if we can figure out how to break those automatic links between certain situations and negative emotions, we might be able to get a handle on those feelings. Okay, so the control value theory doesn't stop there. It also throws in some extra ideas that build on those basic connections between control, value, and emotion. Let's chat about those. One of those is the idea of multiplicity and domain specificity. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is basically the idea that we don't just experience one single emotion, like positive or negative, in relation to achievement. We actually feel a whole bunch of different distinct emotions, and those emotions can be very specific to particular subjects or activities. So you might feel super anxious in math class, but totally enjoy writing essays. It's not like we have one general achievement emotion that applies to everything we do.
Makes sense. Our sense of control and how much we value different things can change dramatically from one subject or activity to another. And the theory also talks about how our achievement goals can impact our appraisals and, as a result, our emotions.
Right. Exactly. So achievement goals are all about what we're aiming for. Are we focused on truly mastering the material, or is it more about performing well and showing everyone how good we are? And those different goals can lead to very different emotional experiences.
Yeah, for sure. So if you're all about mastery, where the focus is on learning and understanding for the sake of it, that tends to lead to more of those positive activity emotions like enjoyment and interest. But if you're really focused on performance, on proving yourself and maybe outdoing others, that often comes with more of those positive outcome emotions like hope and pride. And then there's the flip side of performance goals, which is all about avoiding failure and not looking bad. Those kinds of goals are the ones that often bring on those negative outcome emotions like anxiety and hopelessness.
So it's not just what we're doing, it's why we're doing it. And those underlying motivations can really shape our emotional experience. The theory also brings in individual personality factors, doesn't it? It's not just about the situation and our goals, it's also about who we are as people.
Right? It acknowledges that our individual beliefs about control and value play a big role. Someone who's naturally more optimistic might see things in a more favorable light, which can lead to experiencing more of those positive achievement emotions. And someone who's more pessimistic might be more prone to those negative emotions. And those underlying beliefs about control and value can be very situation-specific, or they can be more general, kind of like our overall outlook on things. And then, of course, there's our environment. The social and cultural factors that surround us definitely impact our emotions as well.
Oh yeah, environment is huge. So what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Well, the theory says that things like how good the teaching is, how much our teachers and parents value achievement, how much freedom we have to make choices in our learning, whether the learning environment is more competitive or collaborative, the expectations others have for us, and the kind of feedback we get. All those things can shape how we see our level of control and the value of what we're learning. And this, in turn, impacts our emotions. It's fascinating, isn't it? There's this study that found students in those advanced, high-ability classrooms might actually experience more negative emotions than students in classrooms with lower average ability, even when everything else is pretty much equal. It's like being in that high-achieving environment can actually create more pressure and anxiety.
Yeah.
And beyond just the classroom itself, our broader culture, the values and norms around achievement can really influence our emotions as well.
So it's this constant interplay of our individual personality and all these forces around us that are shaping our experiences. Now let's get to the big so what question. Why do these achievement emotions even matter? What role do they play in how we learn and achieve things?
Good question. I mean, emotions aren't just these fleeting things that come and go. They actually have a pretty significant impact on how our brains work and how we behave. First off, emotions can either use up or free up those mental resources we need for thinking and learning. And while both positive and negative emotions can grab our attention, positive emotions like enjoyment can actually direct that attention in a way that helps us learn.
Yeah, it's like when you're genuinely enjoying something, you're more present and engaged with it, so you naturally learn better. What about motivation? How do emotions tie into that?
Emotions are major drivers of motivation, for sure. When we feel those positive, activating emotions like the joy of discovering something new, it can make us more motivated to learn, both for the sake of learning itself and because we're excited about the potential rewards that learning can bring. But those negative emotions, the ones that kind of shut us down, like boredom or hopelessness, they can seriously drain our motivation and make us want to give up. And then there are emotions like anxiety, which can be a bit more complicated. Sometimes anxiety can actually push us to work harder because we're trying to avoid failing, but it can also make learning less enjoyable and make us less likely to explore and experiment.
So emotions can either fuel our engines or put on the brakes, depending on the specific emotion. And what about the actual strategies we use to learn? Do emotions play a role there too?
They absolutely do. When we're feeling those positive activating emotions, it seems to help us use more flexible, creative, and deeper learning strategies. But if we're feeling anxious, it might make us more likely to stick with rigid strategies, like just memorizing things without really understanding them. And then those deactivating emotions like boredom, they can lead us to just skim the surface and not really process the information deeply.
So our emotional state can really determine how we approach the whole learning process. What about our ability to be in charge of our own learning, to regulate ourselves? Do emotions have an impact there?
It seems like they do. Those positive emotions like enjoyment and feeling competent, those seem to help us become better self-regulators. We're better able to keep track of our own learning, set goals for ourselves, and change our strategies when we need to. But when we're stuck in those negative emotions, we're more likely to need someone else to guide us and less likely to take initiative in our learning.
So generally, positive emotions create a much more supportive internal environment for learning. But you said it's not always that simple, right? Like positive emotions aren't always the magic bullet, and negative emotions aren't always the enemy.
Exactly. The theory points out that how emotions affect our actual achievement in school and other areas is actually pretty complex. While it's generally true that those positive, activating emotions are a good thing and those negative, deactivating ones are a problem, other emotions can have more nuanced effects, and it really depends on the context. And here's another thing. Always feeling happy isn't necessarily the best thing in the long run. Sometimes pushing through those feelings of discomfort or frustration can actually be what helps us grow and learn the most.
That's a really important point. It's not always about feeling good in the moment. Sometimes those tough emotions are what we need to push ourselves further. And another thing the theory highlights is that these emotions aren't just these static things, right? They change over time, and they can even influence each other.
Exactly. There's this constant back and forth happening between our emotions, our appraisals of control and value, and the environment we're in. The emotions we feel in one situation can actually influence how we see similar situations in the future and how we interact with our environment going forward.
Can you give us an example of how that might play out?
Sure. Imagine a student who really enjoys a particular subject, maybe history. That enjoyment might lead them to spend more time reading about history, going to museums, even having conversations about historical events. And because they're engaging with it more, they start to understand it better and get better grades, which makes them enjoy it even more. That's a positive feedback loop where the enjoyment fuels more engagement, which leads to more success, which fuels even more enjoyment. But it can go the other way too. Let's say a student has a lot of anxiety about math tests. Because of that anxiety, they might avoid practicing math problems, which means they don't do as well on the tests, which just reinforces their anxiety. So now they have even more anxiety about future math tests, and the cycle continues. That's a negative feedback loop.
So it's like these self-fulfilling prophecies where our emotions can create these cycles that either keep us moving forward or hold us back. This brings us to the idea of emotion regulation, how we can learn to manage these achievement emotions and make them work for us.
Yeah, emotion regulation is a superpower, for sure. It's about learning to recognize our emotions, handle them effectively, and use them in a way that supports our goals. And the control value theory offers some specific approaches to doing just that.
I'm all ears. What are some of those strategies?
Well, one approach is called emotion-oriented regulation. This is all about dealing with the feeling itself directly. So you might use relaxation techniques to calm your anxiety or try to see the situation from a different perspective to shift those negative feelings. Another approach is appraisal-oriented regulation. This one is about changing the beliefs and interpretations that are causing those emotions in the first place. So you might challenge those negative thoughts you have about yourself or reconsider how important the outcome really is to you. Problem-oriented regulation is about taking action to improve your skills and gain more control over the situation. This might involve asking for extra help or developing better study habits. And lastly, there's situational modification, which is about actually changing things in your environment. So you might find a quieter place to study or break down a huge project into smaller, more manageable chunks.
So it's like we have this whole toolbox of strategies, and we can pick and choose the ones that fit the situation and our own needs. Now, how do these achievement emotions develop in us in the first place? Is it nature or nurture?
It's a bit of both, really. The development of these emotions is definitely tied to our overall cognitive development, like how good we are at understanding complex situations and making judgments about them. But it's also heavily shaped by our experiences in school and other achievement settings. For example, if we have a lot of experiences with failing, especially if we start to believe it's because we're not smart enough or capable enough, that can lead to us expecting to fail in the future and feeling hopeless. So those early experiences can have a lasting impact on how we feel about achievement later in life. Now, one of the questions the theory tackles is whether these achievement emotions are universal or if they differ depending on things like culture and gender.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Are these emotions basically the same across all humans? Or do they look different depending on where we're from or how we were raised?
The theory leans towards the idea that there's a certain universality to the core mechanisms, like how those appraisals of control and value linked to specific emotions is probably pretty consistent across different cultures and genders. However, the specific things that trigger those emotions, how often we experience them, and how intensely we feel them, can definitely be influenced by things like cultural norms and how boys and girls are socialized differently.
Can you give us some specific examples of how those differences might play out?
Sure. In terms of gender, there's some research that suggests girls might, on average, report feeling less in control and having more negative emotions in those fields that have traditionally been dominated by men, like math and science. And this difference seems to be at least partly explained by how they see their level of control and the value of those subjects. And when it comes to culture, studies comparing students from different countries have found that they sometimes report different average levels of certain emotions. For instance, students from some East Asian cultures might say they experience higher levels of certain emotions than students from Western cultures. But here's the thing. Even when those average levels are different, the basic relationships between control, value, and emotion tend to be pretty similar across cultures. So it's like we all have the same basic emotional machinery, but the specific inputs and outputs can be shaped by our unique backgrounds and experiences. Okay, one more big picture thing to touch on. This theory has some interesting implications for how we think about emotion, motivation, and cognition in learning.
These three always seem so intertwined, it's hard to tease them apart. What does the control value theory have to say about their relationship?
Yeah, they always seem to go hand in hand. So how does the theory address this tangled web of emotion, motivation, and thought?
It acknowledges that these three are super interconnected, and they often happen all at once. But it argues that it's really important to keep them separate as concepts and study them independently. If we don't, our research can get kind of circular. Like if we define motivation only in terms of emotional responses, then it becomes really hard to actually study how emotions influence motivation. We need to have clear definitions and ways of measuring each of those things so we can really understand how they interact. And the theory points out that the whole field of emotion research is kind of fragmented right now, with everyone studying emotions in their own little silos. We need more of these big picture integrative theories like the control value theory to bring all of those pieces together.
That makes a lot of sense. We can't really understand how the pieces fit together if we're just studying them in isolation. Speaking of research, does the theory say anything about how we should be doing research on achievement emotions? Are there certain approaches it recommends?
It definitely does. It basically says we need to get a lot more creative and multifaceted in our research methods. We need to combine the best of both worlds, using both qualitative and quantitative approaches to get a more complete picture. So that means using those tightly controlled experiments to figure out cause and effect, but also doing more real-world observational studies to see how things play out in those messy natural settings. Qualitative research is super important because it helps us really understand the nuances of people's individual emotional experiences, which can then help us develop better quantitative measures and come up with more specific hypotheses to test. And the theory says we need to step up our game when it comes to measuring emotions. We can't just rely on those self-report questionnaires where people tell us how they're feeling. We need to start using more sophisticated tools, like observing facial expressions, measuring physiological things like heart rate and skin conductance, and even using brain imaging techniques like EEGs and fMRIs. Each of those methods gives us different pieces of the puzzle, and together they can paint a much richer picture of what's happening emotionally.
The theory also encourages the development of something called dynamic modeling, which sounds super fancy, but it's basically about using mathematical and computational tools to model how appraisals, emotions, and learning all interact and change over time. It's like creating a simulation of how all those things play off of each other. And here's something I think is really important. The theory stresses the need to look at what's happening within individuals, not just across groups. It's about studying those individual patterns of change over time, rather than just looking at averages and correlations between variables across a whole bunch of people. Just because a study finds a certain relationship between anxiety and test performance, for example, doesn't mean that that exact same relationship will hold true for every single student in the study. We need to look at those individual journeys and see how things unfold differently for different people. There's a method called BIRI,